This week inside the Lords has been a lesson for me in terms of the way legislation works. Yet another lesson where I've realised certain things. I'm actually following through the elections bill, and the elections bill is all about improving the trust in democratic elections, and it's something I'm very interested in, although a lot of the bill is very technical. One thing that to note is that there has been about 5 or 6 hours spent on voter ID, and on Thursday I was really disappointed that I wasn't able to stay for the full debate. I read it all in Hansard, thought I'd missed my chance to discuss voter ID, and then I turn up on Tuesday and they're still talking about voter ID, or Monday, whatever, and in fact it went on for another over 2 hours, and so I spoke on it. We'll get on to that controversial speech in a minute, but when I asked afterwards why so many hours had been spent, I was told that this was effectively opposition parties trying to filibuster the bill, that they were basically spending hours and hours and bringing up loads and loads of points, and allowing a kind of very it was very interesting, wide-ranging discussion, because they want to try and ensure that it doesn't get through before Parliament is prorogued, before the Queen's speech, so that the bill will have to be dropped and re-presented. I then felt guilty that I'd been part and parcel of making a speech that nobody needed to hear. On that speech, I was arguing against voter photo ID when you turn up to vote, and I put that speech up on social media, and I can safely say that it hasn't gone down well with a lot of you who don't agree with me, which is perfectly reasonable. There's two things that have dawned me about this. First of all, a lot of people have said, how can you say that there's no corruption? Look at postal votes. So I wanted to point out that one of the difficulties with reporting on what I'm doing in the Lords by one speech is that this is one amendment, and there's actually loads and loads of other amendments on things like postal ballots that deal with corruption of the electoral system, and it's only the contentious one is on voter photo ID. And I was trying to make a point about show your pass type society, which a lot of you who watch were opposed to when it came to vaccine passes. A lot of people will have been opposed to ID cards in general, are worried about digital ID and all sorts of concerns, but then suddenly everybody wants to have an ID card when you go to vote. And a little bit of me is like, well, can't you see that this is part and parcel of the same move? But also I have to say that the criticisms that have been levelled at me have made me pause, because it's not because I want to give in on principle just because lots of people don't agree with me, but because I think that I realise that people are saying in my area this happens, and people do impersonating just because there's no prosecution, and I realise that I'm in a bubble in the Lords, so I'm sitting there listening to everybody being opposed to the government. I disagree with why they're opposed, and all this rubbish about the Tory trying to steal votes from the working class and black people is nonsense, and they're even more condescending when they say they're not capable of getting ID, because that drives me mad. That's not my objection at all, but you have made me think that maybe this is more of an issue than I'd considered, so I want to just make that concession, and also don't want to fetishise the technical aspect of turning up and having some ID when it is true, if you get a parcel you show ID, I get all that, but I just think that there's a danger here of creating the atmosphere of a lack of trust in voters, and I know that's not what anybody wants to do, and I understand that people are arguing this from the point of view of taking the vote seriously. Anyway, there you go, I've learnt a lesson in that, but I'd like you to note that just one speech is not the whole bill, and that therefore there's lots of elements of it, and that I'm not just speaking about everything when I do my 5 minutes. I also was involved yesterday in an interesting debate on PR versus first past the post. Now again, I was conscious of the fact that probably this was the filibustering stuff, because suddenly we ended up in the middle of a discussion on electoral standard, having this discussion about what type of voting we'd have. And there was an interesting aspect to this, which was the Lib Dem had put in an amendment to bring in PR in general elections, and I'm more convinced by PR now than first past the post than ever before, because I want to break the two-party system. But it was interesting that they wanted to put it in as an amendment that would have basically overturned a referendum result, i.e. the first past the post AV referendum. So there was an interesting split where even some Labour people were saying, believe it or not, to the Lib Dems, you shouldn't be trying to overturn a referendum result by bringing in an amendment. So that was kind of interesting. But what really struck me was that the government on this were just absolutely no way are they even contemplating that. And they were kind of rather snidey I like Lord True, but he's rather snidey about, new parties do emerge, look, the Labour Party did, what's your problem? And really misunderstanding the way that people feel politically homeless. I think that was underestimated. But the reason why it came up, and this was the thing that I don't think was clear, is that the government actually did bring in an amendment that was going to get rid of PR, proportional representation, for the election of police and crime commissioners and elected mayors. And they brought that amendment in late. So them saying, why are you all wasting time discussing PR, is because they brought these amendments in. And I do think that therefore you can just see that legislation just becomes this way of people slipping things in, and I think it's important to hold them to account for that. Another mess I made this week was I gave a speech to the Together campaign about the police and crime bill, and they asked me to speak about the protest legislation, or the attempts at bringing in a tax on protest. And I went into great detail talking about a set of amendments that the government had introduced late in the day at an earlier stage in the bill, explained all about lock-on offences, stop and search without any excuse to stop and search you, a really draconian set of measures. And then when it came back to that House of Lords, none of those things were there. And I realised that actually when the Lords had defeated them the first time round, that was it, they were dead in the water, because the government had made the mistake of introducing them so late that they'd introduced them in the Lords. So once we defeated them in the Lords, that really was a defeat. So I basically am responsible for misinformation by telling people these were the big things that we had to fight. What has come back, and this was in ping pong, was they're still sticking with the noise trigger. They're still sticking with the restrictions on certain demonstrations around the Westminster area, and so I argued against that. But they also brought in they rejected the misogyny, hate crime issue. It's not quite dressed up as hate crime now, but that was really pushed in the Lords. I argued against that. There was a vote, the government lost, and then one thing to note is that the government accepted the Labour Party amendment on fast-track public space protection orders, and I warned that would happen, and not only have the government accepted it, but they've made it more draconian, and now that's going to be in the bill. So the Labour Party, who say they're anti-attacks on protests, have actually helped strengthen the state's hand in terms of protests. The ping pong was really interesting, so we kind of had that. The government lost it goes back to the House of Commons, it's then coming back to us, it's ponging back to us on next Tuesday, I think, and this will go on. At some point the Lords has to give way though, because the Lords, unelected, and there's this thing called the Salisbury Convention, which is effectively a kind of understanding that in the end the Lords don't have the final say, but they can chip away to the government so that they get them to concede on a couple more things. So there's now lots of that going to be happening in the next few weeks. That's going to happen with the Borders Bill and Nationality and Borders Bill. It's happening today with the Skills and Education Bill, and there'll be lots of votes and lots of arguments, and it will be interesting to see what the government gives in on. So that's where we are on that. Just in terms of and a couple of other interesting things. For the first time ever in the last week, the issue of the fact that the vaccine isn't 100% where you have to cheer it at all moments has come up in the Lords from the most unlikely scenario people. Quite a lot of people have been talking about the problems of vaccines that have caused people, and whether the compensation scheme for people who've been injured by the vaccines should be dealt with, and other people have raised the fact that the vaccines seem to be having less impact. And I know it sounds a funny thing to note, but I've just noted that suddenly all these people in the Lords are now prepared to discuss things which were absolutely verboten only recently. So that's an interesting aspect of things. The other issue is on Ukraine, and I want to say something more general, but just to say in terms of the Lords, the constant way that Ukraine is used, by the way, is constantly to just bash the Tories, and goodness knows their Ukraine schemes and giving visas and organising this matching with people in the UK has not exactly been smooth running. That's the understatement of the year, and there's a lot of generosity, people wanting to help and so on. But I do feel sometimes that Ukraine has become one of those situations where people want to wear it as their badge of honour. What I'm doing for Ukrainian refugees. Something about it that's a bit unsavoury that I don't like, and where it's become a kind of very British way of indicating that you're on the right side. I find that unpalatable. In terms of Ukraine in general, I think that we are at the Academy of Ideas realising that we need to really dig into this issue, and I hope after Easter we'll have another big meeting to look at this. It is still the case, and I really understand this, that a combination of two things, a combination of a fairly straightforward and completely reasonable position from people on the left, which is that they understand what Western intervention has meant over the years. They remember Iraq, and we shouldn't forget Iraq, but not just Iraq. Western intervention has generally been devastatingly negative for the places that they've intervened in. And so there's that kind of aspect. And then other people who maybe over the last 2 years have become so disillusioned with Western leaders in terms of the attacks on civil liberties that they've become almost become despondent about every aspect of politics in the West, and see people like Macron and Trudeau and Boris Johnson and all the rest of it as the people who steal civil liberties, two-faced, censors who won't let you find out the information. A combination of those two forces coming together has led to, rather dangerously in my opinion, even if understandably, a real resistance to just simply straightforwardly supporting Ukraine, to the point where, not the people, I hate that phrase, Putin apologist or Putin's, but where people are sort of saying, yes, but what about this, what about that, and almost identifying more with Russia as the victim of Western aggression, and certainly not supporting the West in the West supporting Ukraine, so that we've got ourselves into something of a tangle. And just one analogy that I wanted to just try and see whether you think it works, but it keeps ringing true to me, is when 9/11 happened, when the ISIS bombs happened. When 9/11 happened, I remember a lot of people saying America brought it on itself. The American administration were the warmongers, and although it's terrible 9/11's happened, didn't they bring it on themselves? And I just think in situations like that, where the force of aggression is coming from a body of people, whether it's Putin or ISIS or whatever it is, where the aggression is coming from elsewhere, you don't stand around going, yes, but I don't like the West, so maybe they're all right, really. And if ISIS invaded London tomorrow, you might hate Boris Johnson, but let me tell you, which side would you be on, right? So I think we have to bear those kind of things in mind, without meaning that we're not allowed to discuss, for example, the real problems that NATO has created for millions of people around the world, from Iraq to Libya to the peoples of in fact Eastern Europe over the years. But it's tricky, isn't it? So that's why we're going to have a lot more meetings on it at the Academy of Ideas. It's very important. So finally, I'm going to be very busy for the next few weeks as the government tries to push through legislation without too much scrutiny, and where the opposition parties playing politics will try and put barriers in their way. But whilst all that shenanigans is going on in Parliament, and these are important pieces of legislation, don't get me wrong, we should remember that the bigger picture of politics happens outside Parliament. And I don't just mean in Ukraine, but we've got to consider what this means, what these issues mean beyond the legislative programme. And somebody has just sent me an email perfectly reasonably ranting about the problems of the building safety bill. So I was congratulating myself because I've had a win and we've got rid of the building safety manager. But this is a huge piece of legislation which actually has got loads of problems with it. And my reply to the person who sent me the rant, Jane, who to her credit I agree with a lot of, is, in the end, political change isn't happening in Parliament. It has to happen outside of Parliament, and I really mean that. So I'll keep reporting on what's happening inside the Lords and inside the legislative process. But if anyone thinks we're going to change the world via law and Parliament, you're kidding yourself. Being close up and seeing it the way I do every day, I can tell you it's sclerotic, needs to be completely reformed, and we need to shake things up.